Okay, so writing J is basically just trying to, again, take a step closer to um, figuring out what it is you're going to focus on for the literature review. So I'll talk about that in a second. But so writing J is this. It's very basic. There's these three parts to it. The first is you're basically trying to write out your whatever your traditional narrative is. Again, and now I'm trying to get people to write more than just a sentence or whatever. So you're trying to articulate, the main elements of the old story that you're going to focus on, whatever your subject is. And I'll show you. I'm doing mine, and I'll show you what I mean by that. All right, so you have your narrative, your traditional narrative, and your newer changing narrative. So you have those two things. The next thing you're doing is you're answering these 6 questions. Right, so you're going through each one, and you're trying to identify. These questions are meant to try to help you figure out what you can focus on and what you can talk about, as far as what your sources have and so on. So for example, you have like, what in way has the coherence of the original narrative weakened? Right, so because in theory, the traditional narrative, the way things used to be, the beliefs that people used to have, has changed for some reason. So that's what the coherence means. It's like, so what aspect of it, the character, plot, setting, something has weakened or fallen apart in the traditional one. Then you're trying to focus on what are the things that have caused the change. Right, you're trying to figure out what element, like technology or discoveries or knowledge or whatever. And then 3 is similar in that what way have characters, plot, or setting of each narrative altered. So the first one is like, how does the traditional narrative, what has fallen apart about that? And then number 3 is trying to do what's different about from the traditional to the newer one. So what are the elements that have changed? How have the characters in the traditional story changed? And what are the new characters, or how has the character changed? What's the plot and how has that changed? What's the setting? So those are those elements. In what way has the meaning or the merit, right, meaning the value of the narrative altered? So in my example, my traditional one is like college. You need to go to college to become an educated person, and there's value in being an educated person. That's what we value. In the newer world, or my newer narrative, it's more about people having certain skills, I would say, right? We're more like a skill oriented, like people need to obtain certain skills in order to be successful. So it's not enough just to be, I'm a well-educated person because I took these college courses. It's now like, okay, great, but what else, what can you actually do? So I'd say that's how the meaning and the value of it has changed. The old value is just being educated is a good thing, and that will make you a better person. And the newer value is on skills, like having skills will help you get jobs and do work and so on. In what ways have the audience, so this is sort of like society. So in what ways has a society in each narrative changed? Like, so in the traditional narrative, like the society for me, everybody pretty much was on board. Yep, college is the answer. This is what everybody has to do. And then the newer changing one is sort of like, okay, well, that might not be the only way. People are more skeptical about college. There's not such a given anymore. Like, everybody has to do it. It's starting to shift a little bit to like, well, maybe people can do other things. So that's what I mean by the audience, like whatever, like society usually, how that's changed. So the society now is more skeptical than it used to be about what the value of college, I guess. And then last one is in what ways has some aspect of the narrative fidelity. So remember, narrative fidelity in the narrative paradigm basically means facts have changed, or values have changed, or consequences have changed, consistency, something has changed. So for me, for example, the old narrative, people could work their way through college, right? You had a part-time job, you went to college, you paid all your bills, and you came out with a degree and very little debt at all. That's the old one. Okay, factually, that has changed. The new narrative, people are in debt and it costs way more, and so factually that's a change. And then values, I might go back to the other one, the value of being educated versus the value of having skills. Like, those are the 2 things that I might point out. In any event, you're trying to answer those questions, short answers, and then out of those questions you're trying to identify sort of the 3 main areas that you're going to be able to focus on, that you will talk about. In the literature review, and then you'll sort of develop it more even in the last essay. So that's what writing J is. So in what way has the coherence of the original narrative? So the coherence means I'm looking for right, changes in the way that story holds together in and of itself. So that's sort of the internal elements, right? Changes in the character, plot, setting. So you're basically like, all right, so what's wrong with the old story? Like what elements of the old story are no longer true or have weakened or whatever? How has the character, plot, setting? So that's the way I would explain it, like expand on it more, right? So how is the character, plot, setting or setting of the traditional narrative weakened, become untrue, or become irrelevant, I guess. So this would be a change in sort of the plot, right? So the plot of the old story was I go to college, I get a degree, and I go get a white-collar job. Like I become a manager in an insurance company. So one change in that is that there's now fewer white-collar jobs that exist. Another part of plot that has changed, the idea that you can work your way through college, and then they need the traditional college. So this would be now the setting, right? So the old narrative setting was you have to go to a classroom where a professor lectures, and you take notes and you read the textbook and then you do the things, right? So that was the setting for the old story, was the college classroom. And now, as we are seeing at this very instant, right, that setting is no longer true, like meaning people have other ways to learn. You don't have to be in a college classroom. And then I'd say part of the setting would be like books. You don't necessarily like the textbooks idea, right? Because there's ways to get information. So that's part of, I would say, the setting. So the characters in the old story, right? The characters for me are pretty basic. The professor, that's a character. And the student, that's a character. So professors' roles have changed. So it's no longer the same idea that sort of what they need to be doing is different than what they used to do, right? In general, professors are expected, there's more interaction with students now, and there's more focus on how students learn, right? So before we didn't care about that, right? We just went and lectured and everybody took notes and that was the end of it. Whether you got it, you got it. You didn't. Now there's more focus on how students learn. And that's another change in the role, right? So students have changed. You could also say they're more, you could make the case that they're technologically distracted, right? So it's not all great. Every change from the traditional to the new is not always good, right? Meaning, anyway, technology is probably going to be the biggest changer in my world, right? The thing that's really altered higher education. And the universal value, technology has changed the universal value. The old idea sort of was colleges turn people into thoughtful, educated people in society, right? Like that's sort of the value of it. That was very much the value. And I would have to say this has become weaker, right? Meaning that that's not really the driver of college. It still is to some degree for some people, right? So it's not completely gone. But I would say there's another thing that's stepping in, and that's this idea that you should have skills. You should be obtaining work skills. So it's basically the question is like, how much does this drive people's decision to go to college? This desire to become an educated person, to become a thoughtful, educated member of society. I would say it's weakened, right? That's no longer the primary driver. Now, what would be really great is if I have actual articles or information that will help me say these things, right? I'm sort of winging it here, but I have a few articles, so I'm hoping that they will help me say that. So I say meaning and merit of the traditional narrative has to do with becoming a thoughtful, educated member of society. This has weakened as a ground for people's decisions and been challenged by the newer idea, I'll put that just to make it clear, newer idea that people need to acquire specific skills. Okay. And we have the audience. How has the audience changed? And again, for me, audience is society, right? Because it's going to be like, this is a narrative that society sort of tells itself, and I would just say people are more skeptical than they used to be. That's essentially it. And it doesn't mean like everybody's saying no one should go to college, it's terrible, right? It's just that before it was like a pretty much a given, like, yep, this is absolutely what people do. And recently, and since also because the cost has gone up, all these reasons, right? People start to be like, well, do you really need it, or what, could you get skills somewhere else, and so on. So I would say that that's at least a change in the audience. The society has shifted. They're more skeptical about this idea that you have to go. And then the last thing here is this thing about fidelity. So what are things in narrative fidelity that have changed? So are there facts that have changed? Right, and I was saying consequences is pretty good. Consequences, right? What has changed? Well, again, student debt is a big one. That's a consequence. And a fact. I guess that's a better consequence, though. Anyway, so that's my answer, right, for writing J. These are my things. And so then I'm trying to group them together in order to come up with sort of the main ideas, right, that I can talk about. When I talk about my sources, I think so. Yeah, that might be a pretty good setting. It's going to be tricky, right, because some of these things blend into each other, right? The setting also is part of the... So what you have to identify first, right, is what your traditional what your traditional narrative is going to be, Tao. And once you have what your traditional narrative is, because I forgot we talked about this a little bit, but yeah, I could totally see how that would be a setting, right? Because it's sort of like Blackboard is our setting right now for our class, right? And so you could definitely talk about how Instagram and whatever, Facebook and any of them have become a setting, because that's where we are, and that's a big change from where we used to be, which is a physical setting, right? It used to be a physical setting. I think that could work. Yeah, you probably would want to be, but this could be based on articles. If you have an article, right? If you have an article about a specific Instagram or whatever, right? That probably would be better than just saying social media, especially when you're giving an example, right? Because you're going to be talking, right? So you'd be talking about your articles, and you'll be like, okay, here's this article, and here's what they say. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea. I think this might work, this idea of breaking it into setting, plot, and character. And then I can sort of create my thesis statement from it. And then on Wednesday, I'll sort of do the next step. We'll go to like the outline of what the essay can look like and what each paragraph is trying to do. And we'll go over that on Wednesday.